Going back and playing games from your childhood is always a mixed bag. On one hand, the nostalgia can oftentimes cloud many of the faults of these games, but on the other hand, you may end up ruining your whole childhood. I mean, after all, I slept on a Lightning McQueen pillow, so I wouldn't trust my opinions either. In the case of Pac Man World 2, it's a rather interesting one, because no one can deny that Pac-Man isn't a household name. I mean, it's practically solely responsible for the arcade boom of the 80s after all. Despite the notoriety in its name, and even generally good reception and sales at launch, I don't hear anyone clamoring for a remaster of this franchise like they did with Spyro or Crash Bandicoot. Pac Man World 2 was even nominated by GameSpot for Best Platformer on Xbox, which it didn't win, but still to be nominated means a lot. But I'm gonna go against all this and say that I think this is a very poor platformer and one of the most generic ones I've played from this generation of gaming. So follow along as I discuss why no one is talking about Pac Man World 2 anymore. With Pac Man World 2 being a 3D platformer, the mechanics are pretty well known at this point, and it doesn't do much to differentiate itself from the rest of the genre. The most notable mechanic is Pac-Man's Rev Roll, which has Pac-Man revving in place to gain speed, and when you release, you go flying in the direction you aimed. This ability is used mostly to launch yourself off ramps or cliffs, but there are a few enemy types that require you to Rev Roll them before you can stomp on them. Now, I wish there was stuff to really praise here, but overall, this game has aged more like vinegar rather than wine, especially when you compare to similar games in the genre that were coming out around the same time. Most of, if not all, the deaths and frustration in this game came from poor design or just a poorly coded game rather than my own error, which just made each death that much more frustrating to the point that I honestly had to stop playing this game a few times because the game was just that infuriating. The first issue I had was the camera. My god, this camera. Now, plenty of reviews for modern games will often say that the camera doesn't control well, but when I play the game, I never really see the issues these other reviewers are talking about. But Lord in heaven, this camera made me want to punt it into the next dimension at times. Lots of these early 3D games didn't have amazing camera systems because everyone was still trying to figure out what worked and what didn't, but the decisions that these developers made truly baffle my mind. The camera moves around with the right analog stick, which is standard, but this fucking camera will not behave. The camera is constantly getting stuck on walls or seemingly thin air as it stops me from spinning around and blocking me from seeing where I need to jump, meaning I have to take some leap of faith, except this one does not have a hay bale at the bottom and instead just gives you a big fat game over. Then there are the other issues with the camera, or perhaps it could be the way the textures are done, or just maybe it's me. Regardless, the depth perception in this game is completely fucked, and here's why. Now, jumping and platforming is important in this game. I mean, it's called a platformer, not a walkformer. When I jump in this game, I don't always know that I'm gonna make the jump, even if I'm completely trusting in my own abilities, because I don't have faith that the game is conveying the depth of each jump properly. I know I sound crazy, but trust me, if you played this game, I feel pretty confident you would experience a similar feeling as I did. The poor depth of this game makes it impossible to judge how far a jump really is, and so even by the end of the game, I didn't really have a good grasp on how far I could really jump, so I was still making jumps to places thinking I could make them no problem, only to fall short.
Wanna go down? Can you go downstairs?
The best way to describe jumping is like you're trying to jump within a 2D plane. Imagine if someone asked you to jump across a gap within a wall. If you can't make just the simple act of jumping feel good, then I feel you've already failed before the starting gun was even fired. If the jumping was the only issue here, I feel it could be forgiven, especially considering it is an older game, so some jank and unpolished aspects are to be expected, but the wonky jumping on top of shoddy level design just led to some of the most frustrating platformer levels I've ever played. When you first start playing this game, the level design isn't much of an issue because the levels are pretty short and don't require that much precision jumping, but then you start to get to the later worlds where I assume the developers thought, okay guys, we gotta start making this harder. What can we do? And then they decided the best course of action was to add in stupid gotcha moments in the levels and make you needlessly backtrack to make the levels go on forever. But I don't want to get ahead of myself here, so let's elaborate on both of these issues in more depth. So first, what do I mean by a gotcha moment? Well, I call these gotcha moments. They're moments where you fall for a trap of some kind that would be hard to avoid on your first time through when you didn't know it was coming. I think the best example of this is one of the ice levels where you're running from a giant snowball Indiana Jones style, and you have to run towards the screen rather than away, meaning that you can't really see what you're about to encounter until about a second before you have to react. This type of level isn't new though, as Crash Bandicoot did this as one of its first levels. The thing here though is that there are multiple times where if you accidentally stepped on the ice patches, it was just a guaranteed death that you no longer had control over. This issue is further compounded by the fact that there are times in the same section that the game actively encourages you to use the ice to speed you up and gain more distance from the snowball. This is the most egregious example of a gotcha moment in this game, but it's far from the only one. The most common one being you stepping on a platform that falls shortly after touching it and then figuring out you have to also time this fall with another moving platform. These do in fact make the game harder, but not in any sort of good way. And then we have the backtracking. Holy fuck, the backtracking in some of the later levels gets ridiculous. Rather than letting the player move in a constant forward momentum, lots of the later levels will arbitrarily have you hitting buttons at dead ends and then telling you to go back to where you came from, where there's now a pellet trail that will lead you to the next section. My guess as to why the developers did this is because one, it pads out the game length as you have more level to traverse, which makes the game feel longer, which they desperately need given that the game only takes about 4 hours to beat on a first playthrough, even with all the deaths. And two, they can make certain sections harder by making you have to deal with them twice. So if you could barely make it through the first time, then you're probably fucked because you're likely gonna have to go back through it in reverse. Some of the later levels have you backtracking 2 or 3 times per level, which just makes me feel like some confused grandma trying to find the supermarket. So both these two issues of cheap gotcha moments and copious amounts of backtracking left me never wanting to go back and play a level to get any of the fruits or secrets that I may have missed, which is kind of what these platformers strive for you to do. The amount of times that I've played Crash or Pitfall are so numerous because they're fun and rewarding to play without ever feeling too unfair, which means that going back for that one collectible always felt like the next run I'll get it, even if it actually took me half a dozen tries to actually get it. There are also secret traditional Pac Man stages in most of the levels that you can find, but due to all the annoyances I dealt with in each level, I eventually actively avoided doing these since that just meant more time I had to spend on that level. A game should never be so unbearable that you actively avoid more of it whenever necessary. Now, I'd like to focus also more closely on the water world for just a minute. After all, water levels are notorious for being the worst levels in any game, and these definitely won't change that stereotype. At first, I actually thought they wouldn't be that bad because the game automatically moves you forward, so you just need to avoid any obstacles coming your way. But then it just gets carried away with the hazards when it starts to throw mines and torpedoes at you. On their own, they aren't really a huge threat, though the mines can have a bit of an inconsistent hitbox on them, but lots of times you have to weave weave in and out of mines while torpedoes are coming at you from the front of you, and the issue is that the mines will oftentimes obscure your view so that you can't see where the torpedoes are, leading to cheap damage to you. Then one of the developers must have been going through a tough time or something, because then they introduced the submarine, which just turns these issues up to 11. The main issue with the submarine sections is that if you get hit by a single torpedo, your whole screen shakes like a nuclear war is going on, and the whole earth is about to crack in two. This also causes your submarine to flail around wildly, meaning that you have no control of it, as well as not being able to shoot any obstacles coming up or any other enemies, meaning that this can just cause a chain reaction of you getting hit multiple times, each starting the screen shake and submarine shenanigans all over again. On one last side note, a lot of the final world, especially the maze level, were rather ruined by the emulation, as the emulator gets rid of most of the fog in these levels that were added for atmosphere. The main problem here is that the game also has a much shorter render distance on these levels, meaning that you can sometimes not even know where you're jumping to until you're mid-jump, on top of just making it super jarring as things are just appearing right in front of you. This is still a bit of an issue with pop-in with all levels, but the use of fog in these levels makes it so much more noticeable, whereas the other levels are mostly just in your peripheral if you're really trying to look for it. I'm not faulting the game for any of this, because it's more so the emulator trying to get rid of fog that it thinks is just there to help with render distances on the original hardware, but in this case the fog was an aesthetic choice, so this is more so a warning for anyone who wants to try this game through emulation rather than tracking down an original copy. On a somewhat good note though, the enemies aren't so bad, more so just what kind of drugs were they on when they thought of these character designs. Like, the game has a ram enemy, and now I want you to close your eyes and imagine a ram. Now this is what the developers came up with. And then we have this thing. Like, I don't even know what this is or even what part is which. It just looks like some kind of pile of rocks to me. Now, on a serious note, none of these enemies really have any egregious faults with them. The main problem with them is that they don't really have any unique ways of dealing with them. You just kind of slam your ass on them and they die. And you can use the same strategy for all the enemies in the game except for the ram, which you have to rev roll first, or the ghosts, which require the special pellet that turn them blue. Another huge issue is that a lot of these enemies will show up in later worlds even when they don't fit the art of the level they're in. Like, you'll be seeing the rams in the lava levels, or you'll see some of the enemies from World 1 all the way in World 6. Lazy enemy encounters is one thing, but just being lazy and using old enemies in later levels just feels like the developers just didn't care and wanted to do as minimal effort as possible. But if you thought the enemies had lazy design, then the bosses are some next level shit. They use the same boss not once, not twice, but 3 separate times with only some minimal attack pattern changes. Given that this is a kids game, I could let this slide, but these fights were so needlessly hard due to their janky and broken nature of the game that I ended up despising these 3 boss fights with a burning passion. The last version of this fight, in the fire world, being the worst of the bunch. For the other 2 versions, you could rev roll onto the body of the boss to damage it, but for this last version, he's immune to this. And not just immune, but rev rolling even to the very edge of the body causes Pac Man to fly in the opposite direction so fast he discovers FTL travel. Also, if you don't hit any of the ramps on this fight in the dead center, then you will not make it to the other side, which is just an instant death. Then we also have the fact that any of the fireballs that he shoots at you leave little flame pillars behind, except this has to be some of the hardest to see flames of all time. Like, I feel like it takes more effort to make these flames this hard to see than it would be to just put some shitty flame PNG in its place. The sheer amount of these flame pillars and the fact that you have to constantly be moving around this tiny arena while dodging more fireballs and like 24 flame pillars is almost as impossible as it sounds. The razor thin margin of error in this boss, coupled with the unreliable ramps, led to one of the most frustrating boss fights in recent memory, and it had me stuck on this fight alone for upwards of 30 minutes. With such lazy and copy and paste enemy design on top of reused boss designs, it just made all these different worlds in the game blend together more and more, as it felt like you were doing the same thing and seeing the same enemies in each one. The final boss was different, so I'll give them that, but I wouldn't call it good or interesting. You're basically just running around the arena until the boss gets low enough to actually be damaged. The fight isn't really hard and more so a test of patience, as there aren't any particular moves that make you change up how you deal with the fight. I would have liked if this final boss had used more of the skills and tools that you had learned throughout the game instead of just using one gimmick the whole fight, just like every other fight. Also, the gimmick of the fight, that being using your air kick to hurt him, isn't really well communicated, so on my first run of the fight, I actually just ran around for like 5 minutes waiting for a more obvious tell or opening. For a game with already mediocre boss fights at best, for the final boss fight to honestly be the worst one in the game, it just ends up leaving a really sour taste in your mouth rather than being some kind of positive thing to redeem the rest of the game. I wish there were more positives to say about the bosses of the game, but overall most were either disappointing or borderline game ruining due to their frustrating mechanics. Given how interesting the mechanics of the ghosts in the original arcade game are, where each ghost has a different strategy to get to Pac Man, I just wish that had been the case here with the boss fights. The sound is really the only part of this game that I really don't have any issue with. The sound effects of the game are a nice mix of nostalgic sounds from the old arcade games and some cutesy little comical noises, with the butt bounce sound being a particular favorite. The music is also surprisingly good, with plenty of variety in the tracks, as well as being catchy without going into the territory of annoying. Also, the production value of some of these tracks really is surprising when a lot of the other aspects of this game feel half-baked or just downright lazy. There are multiple instruments, sometimes almost giving off an orchestral feel. Whoever was in charge of the music clearly understood what made these 3D platformer games so great and really tried their hardest to stick to that winning formula while still giving the game its own unique style of music that stands out from the rest in the genre. If only the rest of the game had done the same. Coming into this review, I had really hoped that the game had held up as well as Pitfall, given that these two games were probably the two games that I had played the most as a kid, but unfortunately, as pretty much this whole review has been talking about, it just isn't very fun in my opinion. At the time of release, platformers were pretty much all the rage, so it makes sense that Namco would want a slice of the pie. It's just a shame that it just wasn't the best slice. If I had to pinpoint the biggest fault against this game, it would probably be just the fact that the developers didn't seem to know their audience. The story and enemies seemed to indicate that they wanted this to be a kids game for young ages, but the difficulty seems to indicate that they wanted to make the game for platformer veterans in their teens and early adult years. Difficulty in platformers is nothing new, and in fact is usually synonymous with the genre. The difference here is that none of the difficulty feels fair, and therefore it's not earned. Having a poorly coded and designed game is the reason that games like Lord of the Fallen are not seen as a good Souls-like, despite having all the marks of a Souls game, and Pac Man World 2 is no different in its attempt at a well-made platformer. This game came out in a time in gaming where the possibilities were seemingly increasing at an exponential rate as the technical limitations were becoming less of an issue, so many games came out around this time trying things that were wholly unique, even if they weren't that great. Pac Man World 2 has a lot of good ideas at a conceptual level. It's just that in practice, it's a complete mess that made me want to throw my controller more than anything else. As usual, guys, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe so you can see my future content. And also don't forget to comment any suggestions for games you'd like to see covered in the future. See you guys next time.